She caught the door, left open, not locked, not latched, simply left open, as though he no longer thought it worth the trouble of hiding what he did behind it. If you have ever stood in a doorway and watched your whole life rearrange itself in the space of a single breath, you already know what she felt in that moment, and if you have not, then perhaps you ought to imagine it before you decide what you would have done in her place. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, and stay until the end, because what the Duchess of Alderley did before the sun rose the next morning became the story that all of England would whisper about for a generation. Eleanor Whitmore had not always been a duchy. She had been, for the first 23 years of her life, the eldest daughter of a modest parson in a modest parish in the west of England, a woman who mended her own gloves and counted candle stubs and had never once imagined. Her father had died when she was 19, leaving her and her younger brother with debts instead of dowries. And it was in the difficult years that followed, years of taking in needlework, of teaching the alphabet to squalling children for a shilling an afternoon. Because, walking 3 miles into town because the family could no longer keep a horse, that Eleanor had learned the particular dignity of a woman who has nothing and yet refuses to bend. She had learned to hold her chin level when shopkeepers looked past her. She had learned to smile when she wished to weep. And she had learned above all that kindness costs nothing and is therefore the one luxury a poor woman may always afford, and so she gave it freely to beggars and baronets alike, never once expecting that it would be repaid. It was repaid in the end, in the unlikeliest of fashions. Alaric Vane, Duke of Alderley, had come to the parish that autumn under a name that was not his own, travelling as a plain Mr. Blore, hale, weary of the fortune hunters and simpering mothers who circled every duke in London like gulls around a fishing boat. He had twisted his ankle on the church steps in a sudden downpour, and it was Eleanor, not recognizing him, not caring who he was, seeing only a stranger in pain, who had half carried him into the vicarage, who had bound his ankle with strips torn from her own petticoat, who had fed him bread and broth without once asking who might pay for it. He had watched her, in the days that followed while his ankle mended, doing the same for an old widow down the lane, for a child with a fever, for a dog that had been struck by a cart, and something in him that had long ago gone cold and suspicious had begun, slowly, to thaw. He told her the truth 3 weeks later on the same church steps where he had fallen. She did not curtsy, she did not gasp. She only said, "Well, that explains the boots," and he had laughed for the first time in longer than he could remember. And by Christmas he had asked her to be his wife, and by spring she was the Duchess of Alderley, mistress of a house with 40 rooms and a garden. A woman who had once counted candle stubs now presiding over chandeliers that burned wax by the pound. For 2 years it had been, if not a great romance, then something steadier and perhaps rarer, a partnership built on genuine regard, on late suppers, where he asked her opinion of his ledgers, and she gave it plainly, on mornings when he found her in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled up, arguing happily with the head gardener about the roses. And instead of being scandalized, he had only stood in the doorway and watched her with an expression she had once mistaken for adoration. She had believed in her quiet, unassuming way that she had found in marriage what so few women of any station ever find: a husband who saw her plainly and did not wish her different. The garden itself had been his gift to her in the second spring of their marriage, a walled paradise built at extraordinary expense along the eastern edge of the estate, with a little marble pavilion at its heart, where he claimed he wished to sit with her on summer evenings and watch the stars come out over the river. She had wept when he showed it to her, genuinely wept, and told him it was the loveliest thing anyone had ever built for her sake. She had not known, how could she have known, that a gift built with such tenderness could become, in time, the very place where that tenderness was betrayed. It began, as such things often do, with small absences that seemed at first entirely innocent. The Duke had always been a man of business, and in the 3rd year of their marriage, his business seemed to multiply. Meetings in town that stretched from a day into 3, correspondence that arrived at odd hours and was answered in private, evenings when he claimed a headache and retired to his study rather than to their shared rooms. Eleanor noticed because a woman raised in poverty learns to notice everything, to read the smallest shift in a household's rhythm the way a sailor reads the shifting of the wind, but she said nothing, because she loved him, and love in its early wounded stages prefers explanation to accusation. It was old Nan, her lady's maid, since the earliest days of the marriage, a woman who had come with Eleanor from the parsonage, and had never once forgotten where either of them had started, who first gave voice to what Eleanor had refused to think. "I don't like the way that Mrs. Deverell looks at his Grace," Nan said one evening, brushing out Eleanor's hair with more force than the task required, "nor the way she doesn't look at you at all, when you're standing right in front of her." Mrs. Seraphina Deverell was a widow of uncertain fortune and certain beauty, who had attached herself to the orderly household the previous autumn, ostensibly as a companion to the Duke's elderly aunt, and who had since made herself indispensable in 100 small ways that Eleanor, in her trusting kindness, had never thought to question. Eleanor had told Nan she was imagining things. Nan had said nothing further, but she had begun, without being asked, to keep her own quiet watch. It was Bertram Ashworth, the estate's young solicitor, and a man Eleanor had known since her girlhood in the parsonage. His family had held the neighbouring living, and he and Eleanor had once been childhood playmates before fortune separated them, and then strangely brought them back within the same walls, who first noticed that the estate's accounts no longer balanced as they ought. Bertram had always been a quiet man, careful and precise, the sort who noticed a missing shilling the way another man might notice a missing limb, and in reviewing the household ledgers that autumn at the Duke's own request, he had found discrepancies too large to be clerical error and too carefully hidden to be anything but design. He brought his concerns first to Mr. Hollis, the estate steward, who dismissed them with an ease that struck Bertram as rehearsed. He brought them eventually, and with great reluctance, to Eleanor herself, because he did not yet trust that the Duke was not somehow complicit, and because, though he would never have said this aloud, not even to himself, he had never quite stopped loving the parson's daughter who had once shared his lessons and his laughter, and he could not bear to see her deceived without a word of warning. "I do not know what it means," he told her, standing awkwardly in the estate office with the ledger open between them, "only that it is wrong, and that Hollis does not wish it examined further, and that the sums missing are not small ones, your Grace. They are the sums of a fortune taken slowly enough that no one was meant to notice until it was too late to matter." Eleanor sat very still for a long moment, looking at the columns of figures that Bertram had marked, and felt the first cold thread of suspicion twine itself around the warmth she had always felt for her husband's house. She thought of the absences. She thought of Mrs. Deverell's careful, unlooking politeness. She thought of the sudden urgency in the Duke's business correspondence, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, she allowed herself to wonder whether the man she loved was being deceived by those around him, or whether he was, in some way, she could not yet bring herself to name, deceiving her as well. She did not confront him. Not yet. She had learned, in her years of poverty, the value of patience, of gathering every fact before speaking a single word, because a woman with no power must be twice as certain as a man with plenty before she dares to accuse. She asked Bertram to continue his quiet examination of the accounts. She asked Nan to continue her quiet watch of the house. and she began herself to watch the garden Alaric had built for her with such apparent tenderness, because she had noticed in recent weeks that its gate was sometimes left unlatched at hours when no gardener would have cause to walk there, and that the lamp in the little marble pavilion was sometimes still burning long after she herself had gone to bed alone. The night she caught them, there had been no dramatic sign that this evening would be different from any other. The Duke had claimed a late meeting with his steward, and had not come to supper. Eleanor had eaten alone, as she had eaten alone more nights than she cared to count that season, and had gone up afterward to sit by her window, from which, on clear nights, she could just make out the pale gleam of the pavilion's marble roof above the garden wall. She had told herself for months that she was foolish, that her suspicions did her husband and herself a disservice, that a woman who has been given so much ought not to poison it with jealousy born of nothing more than a maid's whispered doubts. But that night, watching the lamp flare gold against the dark garden, something in her, some instinct honed by years of watching a household's rhythms for the smallest disturbance, told her that foolishness was not what waited for her beyond that wall. She went down without waking a single servant. She crossed the lawn in her house slippers, the dew soaking through the thin silk before she had gone 20 yards, and she let herself through the garden gate that was, as she had known it would be, unlatched. The roses Alaric had planted for her that first spring were in full bloom, their scent thick and sweet in the cooling air, and she walked among them toward the pavilion, with her heart beating so loudly in her ears that she was certain it must be audible from the house itself. And then she stopped, at the edge of the little clearing where the marble pavilion stood, pale and gleaming under the rising moon, and she saw her husband, the Duke of Alderley, the man who had once bound his own ankle with strips of her petticoat and called her the truest woman he had ever known, standing with his hands cradling Seraphina Deverell's face, as though she was something infinitely precious, murmuring words too low for Eleanor to hear, but not too low for her to understand their shape, the shape of promises, the shape of a man telling a woman that she was loved, that she was chosen, that she was the truth, beneath a lie he wore like a coat every time he returned to his wife's side. Eleanor did not scream. She did not weep, not then, not with the two of them still standing there unaware that they had been seen. She stood very still among the roses that her husband had given her as proof of his devotion, and she watched the proof of his devotion to another woman unfold not 10 yards from where she stood, and something in her chest that had been warm for 3 years turned in that single moment to something as cold and hard as the marble beneath their feet. She thought with a clarity that frightened her that she had spent her whole life learning to hold her chin level in the face of humiliation, and that she would not now, of all moments, allow herself to crumble. She turned and she walked back across the dew-soaked lawn, and she did not look back once, and by the time she reached her own chamber, she had already begun, with the same methodical patience that had once taught her to stretch a single candle through 3 long winter nights, to plan precisely what she intended to do about it. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead at the little writing desk in her chamber, and she began, in the careful hand her father had taught her, to compose a list, not of accusations, not of grief, but of instructions, because Eleanor Whitmore had learned long before she became a Duchess that grief accomplishes nothing and action accomplishes everything, and she intended, before the sun rose over Alderley, to have set in motion the ruin of everything her husband and his mistress believed themselves safe to enjoy. The first instruction was for the head gardener, roused from his bed before dawn, with a summons that admitted no argument. Eleanor met him in the estate office, still in the gown she had worn to the garden, though she had changed her slippers, and she told him, in a voice that did not waver, that the eastern garden, every rosebed, every gravel path, every stone of the marble pavilion at its heart, was to be torn down and cleared by morning light. The gardener, a stolid man named Fenwick, who had served the estate for 20 years and had learned never to question a direct order from the mistress of the house, hesitated only long enough to ask whether His Grace had been informed of the change. His Grace, Eleanor said, built that garden for a purpose that no longer exists. He may inform himself of its absence when he wakes. She did not explain further, and Fenwick, seeing something in her face that he had never before observed in 3 years of quiet, gentle instructions from his mistress, did not ask again. He gathered every man he could rouse before, first light, stable hands, footmen, 2 of the younger grooms still blinking sleep from their eyes, and by the time the sky had begun to pale in the east, the roses that had bloomed so sweetly only hours before were being pulled from the earth in great tangled heaps. The gravel paths were being churned to mud beneath a dozen boots, and the marble pavilion, the very stage upon which her husband had murmured his stolen affections, was being dismantled stone by stone under torchlight, its pale columns laid low in the same grass where he had cradled another woman's face and called her precious. Eleanor stood at her window and watched it happen, and she did not weep, though her chest ached with a grief so total that she wondered, distantly, whether it might simply stop her heart. She thought of the 2 years of genuine tenderness she had believed they shared, of the late suppers and the shared opinions on ledgers and roses, and she understood now that either that tenderness had never been entirely real, or that it had been real and he had thrown it away regardless, and she was not yet certain which possibility grieved her more. But grief, she reminded herself, watching the last column of the pavilion topple into the churned earth, was a luxury she could examine later, in private, at her leisure. What mattered now, before the household woke, and the full scope of what she had learned that night made its way into every servant's whispered gossip, was that she moved with the same patient precision that had carried her through every hardship of her girlhood. Before she allowed a single soul beyond Fenwick and Nan to know that the Duchess of Alderley had discovered her husband's betrayal, or that she intended, with the full and terrible calm of a woman who has nothing left to lose because she has already lost the thing she valued most. To make certain that Alaric Vane and Seraphina Devereux paid for it with everything they had ever believed themselves entitled to keep. By the time the household bell rang for the servants' breakfast, the eastern garden was gone entirely, a raw-churned scar of upturned earth where roses had bloomed the evening before, and Eleanor Whitmore, Duchess of Alderley, sat at her writing desk with Bertram Ashworth's ledger open before her, and a second letter half composed at her elbow, and she began, in the cold, clear light of that first morning of her new understanding, to build the case that would end her husband's deception and her own silence forever. The Duke did not discover what had happened until nearly 10 o'clock that morning, having slept, as he so often did after his late meetings with Mr. Hollis, well past his usual hour of rising. He came down to breakfast expecting the ordinary quiet of his household, and found instead a silence of an entirely different character. The servants would not meet his eye. The footman who poured his coffee did so with a hand that trembled slightly, and when he asked, with the easy authority of a man who has never once doubted his own house, obeyed him without question where his wife might be found, he was told only that her Grace had asked not to be disturbed. It was Hollis, arriving in some agitation not 10 minutes later, who first mentioned the garden, and Alaric, still not comprehending the shape of what awaited him, walked out through the east door of the house with the mild irritation of a man expecting some trivial complaint about a broken fence, and found, instead, the whole of his eastern garden reduced to raw-churned earth, the marble pavilion nothing but a scattered ruin of pale stone, half sunk in the mud, and understood, in the space of a single sickening breath, that his wife knew. He found her at last in the estate office, seated calmly behind the desk that had, until that morning, always been his own preserve, with Bertram Ashworth standing at her shoulder and a stack of ledgers and letters arranged before her with the precision of a woman who has spent the entire night preparing for exactly this confrontation. "Eleanor," he began, and something in his voice cracked slightly on her name. "Whatever you believe you saw, I saw exactly what there was to see," she said, and her voice was so steady, so entirely without the tremor of grief he had perhaps expected, that he faltered before he had even finished his sentence. "I have spent the whole of this night deciding what to do with what I saw, and with what Mr. Ashworth has uncovered in your steward's ledgers besides. And I find that I have decided a great deal, Alaric. I find that I have decided everything." He looked in that moment from his wife's calm and terrible composure to the ledgers spread before her, and something in his face, some flicker of the man who had once laughed on a church step at a parson's daughter's dry wit, seemed to understand that whatever storm was coming, it would not be the storm of tears and accusation he had perhaps braced himself to weather. It would be something colder and something far more thorough, and it had already, in the churned ruin of his garden, begun. What Eleanor had learned in the weeks before that night, and confirmed in the hours after it, was this, that Mr. Hollis, the steward who had served the Alderley estate for nearly a decade, had for the better part of 2 years been quietly diverting funds from the estate's rents and investments into accounts that led, by a circuitous and carefully obscured route, a gentleman of fashionable habits and no visible income who had lately taken rooms in London considerably grander than his circumstances ought to have allowed. The scheme was not merely theft, though theft alone would have been sufficient to ruin Hollis 100 times over. It was theft, dressed as investment, funds recorded in the ledgers as payments towards speculative ventures that existed nowhere but on paper, ventures that returned nothing because they had never been real, while the actual coin flowed steadily and invisibly into Deverell coffers. Bertram had traced it through 11 months of patient, careful cross-referencing, matching dates and sums with a precision that left no room for innocent explanation, and had brought his final proof to Eleanor only hours before she walked into the garden. It was Alaric's own blindness, Eleanor understood now, that had allowed both betrayals to flourish unchecked. His trust in Hollis, a man he had inherited from his father and never once thought to question, and his infatuation with Seraphina, whose company he had come to crave precisely because she offered him, in her practised attentions, the illusion of being adored without the inconvenient honesty his wife had always given him instead. Eleanor did not yet know, and would not know for some days more, whether her husband had been merely weak or truly wicked, whether he had been seduced into blindness or had chosen it deliberately, and she found, turning the question over in the cold, clear light of that terrible morning, what mattered was that both betrayals, the theft and the affair, were bound together at the root, that Seraphina Deverell's affections and her brother's fortune were 2 branches of the same poisoned tree, and that exposing one would necessarily expose the other publicly, completely, before every soul in the county who had ever admired the Duke and Duchess of Alderley as a model of contented marriage. "You will not speak to her again," Eleanor said, rising from behind the desk at last. And there was nothing in her voice of pleading, nothing of the wounded wife begging for reassurance. "You will not speak to Hollis again, save to inform him that his services are no longer required, and that Mr. Ashworth will be reviewing every transaction he has ever authorized on this estate's behalf." and you will attend the assembly at Lord Carrow's on Thursday next, as we have long been engaged to do, because I intend, Alaric, to finish what I began in the garden last night, and I intend to finish it where the whole of the county can watch me do it." He stared at her, and for the first time in the whole of their marriage, Eleanor saw something in her husband's face that she had never before had cause to recognize. Fear, plain and unadorned. The fear of a man who has always assumed his own power sufficient to weather any storm. Confronting for the first time a woman who no longer required his power to weather anything at all. The days that followed the discovery in the garden were, for Eleanor, a study in the particular discipline of grief postponed. She did not permit herself to weep, not in the daylight hours when servants might observe her composure crack, though at night, alone in the chamber she had once shared so willingly with her husband, she allowed herself brief and furious storms of tears that she scrubbed from her face before Nan came to wake her each morning. Nan, who had suspected the truth for weeks before Eleanor herself would admit it, said little, offering instead the quiet, steady comfort of a woman who had known her mistress since girlhood and required no explanation for grief she had half expected. "You'll not let them see you broken," Nan said once, brushing out Eleanor's hair with the same gentle, familiar strokes she had used since the parsonage days. "Not them? Not after everything you've built." Bertram Ashworth, for his part, threw himself into the examination of Hollis's ledgers with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession-driven, Eleanor suspected, by feelings toward her that neither of them had ever spoken aloud, but that had lived quietly between them since their shared childhood, in the years since her marriage had placed her beyond his reach. He worked through the nights in the estate office, cross-referencing every transaction against the estate's actual holdings, tracing the false investments back to their true destination, building a case so thorough and so damning that even Hollis's most practiced excuses would crumble against it. "There is more here than I first believed," he told Eleanor one evening, some 4 days after the discovery in the garden, his eyes red-rimmed from candlelight and careful reading. "Hollis has not acted alone in the strictest sense. There are letters here, between himself and Deverell's brother, that make plain the scheme was proposed by the Deverells from the very start, that Mrs. Deverell's presence in this household was never accidental, that she was placed here deliberately, your grace, to secure both the Duke's affections and the estate's coin at once." Eleanor absorbed this new knowledge with the same cold, careful composure she had shown since the night of the garden, though privately it deepened her fury rather than easing it. The knowledge that she had not merely been betrayed by weakness or by chance, but had been the deliberate target of a scheme calculated with the same patience she herself now brought to its unravelling. She thought of Seraphina Deverell's careful, unlooking politeness across 3 years of shared meals and shared evenings, and understood now that every moment of it had been performance, that the woman had studied her the way a hunter studies a deer's path before setting a trap, and something in Eleanor that might once have wished, and in some small private corner of her heart, to simply forgive and forget and preserve what remained of her marriage, hardened, instead, into a resolve as unyielding as the marble that had once formed her garden's pavilion and now lay broken in churned mud. The Duke, meanwhile, moved through those same days like a man half asleep, unable to reconcile the wife he had known, gentle, quiet, endlessly forgiving of small faults, with the woman who now conducted the estate's business from behind his own desk with a composure that unsettled him more than any weeping accusation could have done. He attempted, twice, to speak with her privately, to offer some explanation or apology, and both times Eleanor received him with a courtesy so complete and so utterly without warmth that he found himself unable to say anything at all beyond her name, spoken with a helplessness that she noted. He did not see Seraphina again as Eleanor had commanded, though whether from genuine remorse or simple cowardice in the face of his wife's terrible new composure, Eleanor could not yet say, and did not particularly care to determine. What mattered in those 4 long days was the case being built stone by stone in the estate office as methodically as the pavilion itself had once been built stone by stone in the garden. And Eleanor found in the building of it a grim satisfaction that came closer to peace than anything she had felt since the night the lamp had burned gold and terrible above the garden wall. Lord Caro's assembly was, in an ordinary season, the largest gathering the county produced outside of the London campaigns, a night when every family of consequence for 30 miles crowded into the Caro ballroom to see and be seen, to arrange marriages and settle rivalries and exchange the particular gossip that could only be properly shared face to face. Eleanor had attended a dozen such assemblies since her marriage, always at Alaric's side, always conscious of the particular pride with which he had once introduced her, the parson's daughter he had chosen for her true worth rather than her fortune, a fact he had once seemed to delight in announcing to anyone who would listen. She wondered, dressing that evening in a gown of deep blue silk that Nan had chosen with unusual care, whether he still felt any of that pride, or whether it had curdled, along with everything else, into the guilty silence that had characterized every meal they had shared since the garden's destruction. She had told him only that she intended to speak that evening, and that he would stand beside her when she did so, and he had agreed, perhaps because he understood by now that refusal would accomplish nothing, or perhaps because some remaining shred of the man who had once bound his own ankle with her petticoat wished to see, even in his own ruin, that justice be properly done. Mr. Hollis had been dismissed from the estate 3 days prior, his final wages withheld, ending the completion of Bertram's investigation, and he had gone, by all reports, to London, though Eleanor suspected he would not remain there once the fuller scope of his crimes became public. Seraphina Deverell, remarkably, had not fled, whether from arrogance or from ignorance of how thoroughly her scheme had already unravelled. She had accepted her own invitation to Lord Caro's assembly, and would, Eleanor knew, from a quiet word with Lady Caro herself, be present that very evening, dressed no doubt in some gown calculated to outshine every woman in the room, unaware that the room had already gathered, in whispers and half-formed rumours carried by servants, who talked to other servants, more knowledge of her true character than she could possibly imagine. The ballroom that evening blazed with the particular brilliance of a county assembly at its height, 1,000 candles reflected in gilt mirrors, the orchestra tuning in the gallery above, the great doors thrown open to admit a steady stream of carriages, disgorging silk and jewels, and careful, calculating smiles. Eleanor entered on her husband's arm as she had entered a dozen such rooms before, and felt the familiar weight of 100 eyes assessing her, though tonight, for the first time, she found she did not care in the slightest what any of them concluded from her composed and steady bearing. Spent a lifetime learning to hold her chin level in rooms far less forgiving than this one, and she intended, before the night's end, to demonstrate precisely what that discipline had taught her. Seraphina Deverell arrived some 20 minutes later, resplendent in a gown of rose silk that drew every eye in the room precisely as she had intended, and Eleanor watched from across the ballroom as the woman moved through the gathered guests with the easy confidence of someone who had never once imagined that her careful performance might already be done ravelling. She saw Alaric first, and something passed across her face, a flicker of alarm, perhaps, at finding him standing so close beside his wife, so entirely unavailable to the private words she had perhaps hoped to exchange. But she recovered quickly, as women of her particular practised charm always did, and made her way toward them both with a smile that Eleanor recognized, now with a clarity that would have been impossible only a week before, as entirely false from root to blossom. "Your Grace," Seraphina said, dropping a curtsy of precisely calculated depth, "and your Grace." This to Alaric, with a warmth she perhaps believed subtle. "How delighted I am to see you both looking so well this evening." "How kind," Eleanor said, and smiled, and felt the whole of the ballroom's attention, drawn by some instinct that gatherings of this kind always seem to possess, beginning to settle upon the three of them, standing together near the centre of the room. "I wonder, Mrs. Deverell, whether you might indulge me in a small matter of business before the dancing begins." Ashworth has been so good as to compile a rather thorough accounting of certain transactions concerning the Alderley estate, and I find I have some questions regarding your brother's involvement in them. The words fell into the ballroom with the particular weight of a stone dropped into still water, and Eleanor watched the ripples spread outward, first across Seraphina's own face, where the practised smile faltered and then froze, and then across the faces of the guests nearest them, who had caught the tenor, if not yet the full substance of what had been said, and then, in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, across the whole of the assembled room, as whispers carried the words from group to group faster than any servant's gossip ever could. Bertram Ashworth, who had been standing quietly near the ballroom's edge, with a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm, stepped forward now at Eleanor's small signal, and the orchestra in the gallery, sensing perhaps that something extraordinary was unfolding below them, allowed their tuning to trail into an uncertain silence. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace," Seraphina said, and her voice, for the first time in Eleanor's 3 years' acquaintance with her, carried a thin edge of genuine fear. "I mean," Eleanor said, and her voice, pitched to carry across the whole of the now silent ballroom, did not waver, "that your brother has, for these 2 years past, been receiving funds diverted from my husband's estate by means of falsified investments. Hollis, the estate's former steward, funds amounting, by Mr. Ashworth's careful accounting, to some £11,000. I mean that these arrangements were, according to correspondence Mr. Bling, Ashworth has recovered, proposed by your own hand before you ever set foot in the Alderley household, and that your presence here these 3 years past has been, from its very first day, a calculated deception designed to secure both my husband's fortune and, I have since discovered for myself, his affections besides." The silence that followed was total, the kind of silence that seems to press against the ears, broken only by the small, shocked intake of breath from a dozen guests at once, by the rustle of silk, as heads turned towards Seraphina Deverell with an attention no rose-coloured gown could ever have earned on its own merit. Alaric, standing beside his wife, had gone entirely white, and Eleanor felt, even in the depths of her own controlled fury, a small, strange flicker of pity for him, standing exposed before the whole of the county, as a man who had been made a fool of twice over, once by his steward's theft, and once by his own heart's blind and misplaced trust. "This is," Seraphina began, and then stopped, because there was nothing, in truth, that she could say that would undo the weight of Bertram Ashworth's careful documentation, now being passed, at Eleanor's quiet nod, into the hands of Lord Carrow himself, a magistrate as well as a host, who opened the portfolio with the grave and careful attention of a man who understood precisely what significance the assembled evidence carried. "This is a misunderstanding entirely, Mr. Hollis has already confessed the particulars in writing before he departed for London 3 days past," Bertram said quietly, though his voice carried, in the ballroom's dreadful silence, as clearly as if he had shouted it. "He named your brother, madam, and he named you as the architects of the scheme from its very inception. What followed was the particular chaos of a scandal breaking in real time before an audience that had gathered for an evening of dancing and found instead a spectacle no invented drama could have equalled. Guests murmuring in scandalized clusters, Lord Carow calling for quiet with the authority of a magistrate rather than a host. Seraphina Deverell's face passing through disbelief and outrage, and finally, as the weight of the assembled proof became undeniable, into a pale and brittle silence of her own. She was escorted from the ballroom within the half-hour, at Lord Carow's own direction, to await the formal proceedings that would follow in the coming weeks, and the whispers that trailed her exit were the same whispers that had once, in gentler days, trailed Eleanor's own quiet, patient goodness. Except that these whispers carried nothing of admiration, only the particular satisfied contempt that society reserves for those whose careful performances have, finally, publicly, catastrophically. Larrick did not speak in the aftermath beyond a single low word to his wife Eleanor, spoken with a helplessness that carried, for the first time since the garden's destruction, something that might have been genuine grief rather than mere fear of consequence. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment in the half-emptied ballroom, with its candles still blazing over the wreckage of what had, an hour before, promised to be an ordinary evening's entertainment, and found that she did not yet know what she felt toward him, whether the anger that had carried her through the garden's destruction and the ledger's examination and this night's careful public reckoning had burned itself out entirely, or whether it merely waited, banked like coals, for some quieter hour. "We will speak of it at home," she said, and that was all, and she took Bertram Ashworth's arm rather than her husband's to walk from the ballroom. And if any among the scandalized guests thought that particular choice significant, none dared say so aloud. The weeks that followed Lord Carow's assembly brought a slower, quieter reckoning than the ballroom's dramatic exposure had promised. The formal legal proceedings against Hollis, who was found within the fortnight and returned to stand trial for his theft, the ruin of Seraphina Deverell's brother, whose fashionable London rooms were vacated within days of the scandal reaching the capital, and whose creditors, sensing blood in the water, descended upon whatever remained of his fortune with the swift efficiency of men who had perhaps always suspected the source of his sudden prosperity was too good. Prompt and painful reckoning between Eleanor and her husband, conducted not in ballrooms before assembled witnesses, but in the quiet privacy of the estate office where their marriage's true accounting must, in the end, be settled. Alaric came to her there some 3 weeks after the assembly, on an evening when the autumn rain beat steadily against the windows and the estate's business had, for once, been fully concluded. Hollis's crimes documented and delivered to the proper authorities, the estate's finances restored under Bertram's careful new stewardship, Seraphina Deverell, gone from the county entirely and unlikely, by all report, ever to return, found Eleanor at the desk that had become, in these past weeks, entirely her own, and he stood for a long moment in the doorway before he spoke, in a voice stripped of the easy authority that had characterized every word he had spoken to her across the whole of their marriage until the night she found him in the garden. "I do not ask you to forgive me," he said. "I do not believe I deserve it, and I have had these 3 weeks to understand precisely how little I deserve it. I was weak, Eleanor, and vain, and I allowed a woman's flattery to blind me to a devotion I had already been given and had never once had cause to doubt, and I destroyed with my own hand the one thing in my life that had ever been entirely real. I do not know what remains to be salvaged of what we had. I know only that I am sorrier than I have words to express, and that I will spend whatever years remain to me, if you will permit it, trying to prove that sorrow rather than merely speaking it." Eleanor listened to this in silence, her hands folded upon the desk before her, and found that the anger she had carried since the garden's destruction had, Indeed, burned down at last to something quieter and more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps not ever entirely, but something that might, given time and proof rather than mere words, grow into a new understanding between them, different in its foundations from the trust she had once given so freely and so completely. "I built my whole girlhood," she said at last, "on the understanding that a person's worth is proven by what they do when no one is watching, not by what they say when they are caught. You built me a garden once, Alaric, and told me it was proof of your devotion, and I believed you, because I had no reason then to doubt a man who had never once given me cause. I do not know yet whether I can believe you again, but I find that I am willing, for the first time since that night, to watch and see." It was not the ending of a fairy tale, precisely, the sort of complete and easy resolution that Eleanor's own girlhood tales had always promised to good women who suffered patiently and were rewarded in the end with perfect happiness. It was something slower and more honest than that, a marriage rebuilt not upon the easy warmth of early devotion, but upon the harder, more durable foundation of proof demanded, and, slowly, over the months and years that followed, proof given. Bertram Ashworth remained at Alderley as the estate's trusted solicitor, his own quiet feelings toward Eleanor folded away, as they had always been, beneath the steady, loyal friendship he had offered her since girlhood. Content, it seemed, to have served her honour even where he could not claim her heart. The Eastern garden was never rebuilt in its old form. In its place, the following spring, Eleanor planted a simpler garden of her own design, without walls, without a hidden pavilion, open to the sky and to any eye that cared to look upon it, and she told Nan. The one evening they stood together, watching the first green shoots break through the churned and long-since settled earth, that she found she preferred a garden with nothing left to hide. The county remembered for years afterward the night the Duchess of Alderley had stood in Lord Carrow's ballroom and brought down a thief and a schemer with nothing more than a solicitor's careful ledger and a voice that never once wavered, and they told the story in the way such stories are always told, as proof that a woman raised with nothing may yet possess more true strength than any fortune could purchase, and that the quiet dignity of a life spent doing right, even when no reward seemed likely to follow, is worth more in the end than any garden built by careless hands to hide a lie. Eleanor Whitmore, who had once counted candle stubs through long winter nights and never imagined her name would be spoken with such regard by an entire county, understood at last, standing in her new garden beneath an open autumn sky, that the truest inheritance she had ever received was not the title she had married into, nor the fortune that came with it, but the unbending patience her hardship had taught her the discipline to act, rather than merely to grieve, and the certainty, hard won and never again to be forgotten, that a woman who refuses to be broken cannot, in the end, ever truly be ruined. End.